Holidays, everyone. My name is Kelly Munn, and I'm with the League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series called Lunchtime LEVinars. We started this series over 3 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. And we're pleased to offer these webinars thanks to the generous support of our sponsor, the Boeing Company. Today we'll hear from Daniel Zavala, our LEV's new Policy and Government Affairs Director. He's going to explain the legislative landscape and answer your questions on how the 2017 session is going to unfold. But first, let me give you a little background on Daniel. Daniel's a Washington native with family on both sides of the mountains. His path to policy work was shaped by his parents' background in education and social justice. His career started in the classroom as a bilingual special education teacher after finishing his bachelor's and master's degrees at Stanford University. As a teacher for students with special needs, he saw firsthand the intersection of law and policy in the classroom. After teaching, he earned his law degree at the University of Washington, focusing on education issues and working with the education groups and the Washington State Attorney General's Office in the Education Division. After law school, Daniel worked for Students First on a state-level policy, and most recently served as the Deputy Director at Tennessee CAN. When not on campus in Olympia, Daniel spends his free time exploring the many natural wonders of the Evergreen State and training for the Ironman triathlons. So before we begin, let's do a couple of housekeeping items. You'll notice a chat function on the right side of your screen. This is a place for you to pose questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or at info@educationvoters.org. With that, I'd like to welcome Daniel. Daniel.
Thank you, Kelly. So as kind of been posed, we're going to talk about what to expect in the 2017 session. I think Kelly said that it's going to be information on how it will unfold. I just give the disclaimer that it's going to be more like a crystal ball reading based on some real-time data. So with that, there'll be kind of three main parts that I want to go over in my time with you. The first is on just the legislature and committee assignments that we know thus far. The second is on the governor's proposed budget that came out last Wednesday. And then the third is just on other education items that were either touched on in the budget or were not necessarily included specifically. So with that, I'll go ahead and go into the chamber membership and looking at what the legislature landscape and will look like this year. So after our 2016 elections, the leadership in both caucuses remains the same, with the Senate controlled by the Republicans and the House controlled by the Democrats. We have 14 new members in the House and 8 new members in the Senate. So what that means is we have a lot of new faces down in Olympia, and so a lot of opportunities to engage new members that are down there. In terms of Senate committee membership, for the Democrats, we actually don't know what the committee assignments will be. It is likely that those will be posted today. So if this were given tomorrow, I'd perhaps have more information, but for now, that's all to be determined. In terms of early learning and K-12 education, you can see that Senator-elect Zeiger will be the chair. And also on the higher education side, you can see Senator Wilson as the chair. In terms of House committee membership, and I won't read through all of these, I'll certainly give you an opportunity to kind of stay on this slide and read through them yourselves. But as you can see in House education, Santos will remain the chair. And on the Republican side, the ranking member will be Representative Harris. And in terms of early learning and human services, Representative Kagi will be the chair, with Dent being the ranking member of the Republicans. And in higher education, Hansen will be the chair, with Holy being the Republicans' ranking member. So again, I'll just give you kind of a moment to look through these. Okay, so as I mentioned last Wednesday on the 14th, Governor Inslee proposed his budget. And the K-12 elements were kind of, pretty substantial in terms of the increase of funding that was suggested for education. As you know, this is a McCleary year, as it's been dubbed. And so the suggestions in here are the governor's proposal in terms of how to address the McCleary mandate from our state Supreme Court decision. So there's $3.9 billion in education enhancements, $3 billion of that going towards staff salary. And that also includes an additional 10 days of professional development per year for teachers. We also saw about $500 million for implementing the K-3 class size reduction. Of that, $4.4 billion is actually going to be in new revenue from taxes under the proposed budget. And as you can see, those taxes come from various sources, including capital gains, including exemptions, and B&O taxes, and carbon tax. Notably under this, under the governor's proposed budget, there won't be any changes to the local levy system. So the levy cliff that's set to expire in 2018 was not addressed within this budget. And another notable component of it is that the teacher contract is recommended to move to 10 months instead of the current contract year of 180 days. Other K-12 elements that were not specifically addressed within the budget that will certainly be of note and will likely be raised through members of either chamber or both chambers include issues around our educator compensation, so including stuff around more stuff around professional development, around mentoring opportunities, as well as leadership pathways as a means for compensation. And a larger conversation around efforts to recruit and retain teachers, especially in hard-to-staff schools, subjects, and regions. Around the LAP funding, while there is noted increase in LAP funding within the governor's budget, proposed budget, the actual amount and eligibility, particularly around the eligibility and how those LAP funds are calculated, is an issue that we know will still be discussed. Other areas include expanded learning, career and technical education, and dual credit opportunities, and other areas around post-secondary opportunities within the high school environment. And another one is looking at funding and allocation models. So not looking at just increasing the funds for K-12 education, but how those funds are allocated. And then finally looking at the accountability model. So the governor proposed $4 million for the RAD school improvement districts. So one other area to look within this is what other expansive things are we going to, can be proposed, I should say, or are going to be discussed around school and district level resources and support. Around early learning and higher education, the governor proposed $42 million for ECAP expansion, which amounts to about 1,500 additional slots by 2018-19. So we know based on the current amount of families eligible and interested, this is still leaves a gap of about, or sorry, there's a current gap of about 7,400. So it works towards closing that gap right now. Other areas around early learning that we know will be of discussion include the reimbursement rate for early learning programs, as well as facilities available for those. In terms of higher education, the governor proposed a tuition freeze for 2- and 4-year institutions, and also proposed a $116 million increase in the state need grant that would serve about 14,000 of the 23,000 students that are eligible and still unserved. And finally, moving on to other items, one other large item of note is the proposed Department of Children, Youth, and Families, which would be a consolidation of other departments and areas within state government focused on early learning and health and human services. And then in terms of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the U.S. Department of Education and the federal government's directive around education within the states, it's notable that the consolidated plan that's been proposed under our Superintendent Dorn is currently in a public comment period. That began on November 15th, and it lasts for at least 90 days. That said, we know that submission has now been changed to either be April or September of next year, with implementation delayed for an additional year until 2018-19. And so the public comment period for that will last for at least 90 days, but the conversation will certainly continue on further in terms of what Washington's ultimate plan around ESSA compliance would look like. So we also suggest that you go to the Superintendent of Public Instruction website to submit any comment if you have any. With that, I'll go ahead and kick it over to Kelly to ask me any questions that I've already asked.
Thank you, Daniel. We have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Folks who are listening, please type your questions into the chat feature on the right-hand side of the screen. And I want to remind you that literally no question is too basic. There is always a lot of jargon in these discussions, and since we work in this field, we forget that we're saying jargon, because to us it's like something we say every single day. So please ask us questions and type them in the chat feature. I'm going to start with one that has already come in, and that is, what is the levee cliff?
The levee cliff. Great question, and one that I'm certainly not an expert on, and if I wish anything, I wish I had Jake Vela, our resident policy genius around funding and levies, with me to explain probably in better detail. But in the rudimentary aspect, I can explain it. It goes back to the ways that local districts are actually funding their schools and making up that additional gap. And so what it allowed was the state to increase the percent at which local districts could raise their local levy in order to fill in kind of the gaps that we saw in terms of funding education. And so what we know is that with that is set to expire. And so if the legislature does not address the mandate set forth by the Supreme Court by a certain directed time, there will be an additional year that increase in levy rate will be allowed at the local level. But either way, it's set to expire at that time to go back. And so the local share that amounts to what has been, generated through that additional levy amount will drop down to the formally permitted amount, which I hope provides some basic explanation.
Daniel, what is LAP funding?
So LAP funding are funds that are generated right now with the focus around K-4 literacy for students that are eligible for it. And so that LAP funding actually goes to districts and can be used to do targeted supports, to provide resources. And what we know is that the LAP funding is generally provided by a lot of our paraeducators across the state, but with the intended purpose of focusing on those, academic gaps and needs, particularly around K-4 literacy.
So back to the governor's budget, you had mentioned that the teacher's contract would switch from 180 days to 10 months. What does that actually mean to teachers?
That's a good question. I think a lot of that would depend on kind of, not perhaps who you're asking, but how you're looking at kind of what the school year would look like under a 10-month plan. And so I think right now the notion of the way that the 180 days moves forward, every professional development day will either, go into that 180 days or have to be paid for in addition to that. And so if we move toward a 10-month structure, that allows kind of more flexibility in terms of how school programming can work, whether it's instructional time, whether that's the professional development days or other programming and scheduling that can be included within that more expanded time.
Does that mean, though, that students could actually be in the classroom less because perhaps it's a professional development day and therefore they're not in the classroom, the students?
So I'm trying to think if what would be changed under a 10-month plan would be any different than what is currently existing under a 180-day. And I don't know if, and that, yeah, so that would be something, and if anybody else has a question, perhaps we'd better get back to you in terms of what would be allowed or not allowed under that change structure in terms of how instructional time is calculated and where professional days are permitted.
We have another last question. Are there any other allocations in the governor's budget for closing the achievement gap other than the relatively small amount for LAP funds?
So, like specifically targeted toward that, I think is a good question. I know that the governor proposed $4 million toward the RAD school districts, and so looking at kind of where our kind of lowest performing as well as highest need schools are. That said, right, that's not necessarily going to be anything that's markedly different than what's included in the LAP in terms of a total amount of funding. Largely we see the bulk of this funding going toward educator salaries, and in many ways that can be used as a means toward the achievement gap, right, and toward the opportunity gap, because when we're looking at, and a factor commonly discussed is that teachers being the most impactful in-school factor for students. And so if we're talking about the bulk of that funding going toward educator salaries, then we certainly can make the case that if we use that to create a compensation model that attracts, retains, and promotes educators that are really doing significant work around addressing those needs, around targeting specific supports for students who are most in need, then that money can be translated to a narrowing of that opportunity gap.
So back to the levy cliff, what is your best guess as to why the governor has not addressed the levy cliff and the key issue of using local levies to pay for teacher salaries, which is what the court has determined to be unconstitutional?
So,
you're getting hit with the easy one.
Yeah, so at the same time, right, like I don't want to speculate as to why the governor has or has not addressed it, right? I think partially what we see, right, is a significant increase in education funds, right, and what the governor has outlined to be his answer to the McCleary mandate. And so, I'm trying to answer the question in a way that doesn't speculate, but certainly a case could be made that the amount of funds that are going to be put into education are significant enough that whatever funding would be lost after the levy cliff expires would then, they're more substantial than the amount that would be lost, and so that mandate in terms of fully funding basic education would still be met. But that said, I don't think I can speculate as to kind of why the governor didn't address the levy cliff specifically.
So this question is, can you talk more about the funding allocation model and accountability that was on slide 7? And I'd like to mention that behind the scenes, always on this, behind the scenes but running the show, is Eric Corman, our communications director. And I'm going to ask Eric to get to slide 7.
Sure. So
that we can re-show it. And Daniel, so again, can you talk more about the funding allocation model and accountability on slide 7?
Yeah, so right now our funding allocation model in Washington is what people commonly refer to as the prototypical model, which has been in place for a number of years, and I think both parties, camps on both sides will know the benefits of it, the disadvantages of it as well. And so all that's to say is that part of the conversation is while we're increasing a significant amount of funds into our education system, should those funds go through the existing funding model, that prototypical model, or should we rethink how we're actually going to allocate those funds? So how those funds will actually be generated, whether that's at the staff level, whether that's at the student level, whether that's at the school level or some other means, and also how those funds are actually one, how they're generated in terms of, the total amount based on either student need or staff type, but then also how those funds are then going from the state to individual districts. And so, there's a number of ways that can happen, including, more student-weighted formula models, looking at, district budgets that more heavily weight, allowing, districts with, students with higher need to get additional funds rather than, through an auxiliary program. So right now we have, a good example would be special education. So we have our special education funds generated, but we also have a safety net program that kind of provides that supplemental. And, part of looking at that funding and allocation model would then allow us to maybe say, do we combine all of this into one so that it's, perhaps all streamlined through one central funding or allocation model? So I guess the broad answer to that is that there are certainly various types of funding and allocation models out there, and just our purpose in raising it is more that it's going to be a conversation that's going to happen in Olympia, and that there will be several suggestions made based on existing model types in other states, but also on perhaps some that we create here in Washington ourselves.
So let's switch to school construction. What about the K-12 school construction budget, the capital budget, to help with K-3 class reductions? Did the governor address this? So, that's a good question. I don't know. It's going to have to be the pure honest answer. I didn't see anything that was specifically addressing that, and so that's not to say that it's not fleshed out later on in detail. So here's a question about the Senate Republicans. I'm also going to put in the House Democrats. How have the Senate Republicans and or the House Democrats indicated that they may propose in order to address McCleary? Yeah, great question, and actually raises a point that I should have made earlier. So the governor proposed his budget last Wednesday on the 14th. So next up is actually the Senate Republicans' turn, right? So this question hits right at that in terms of, what's their response to the state, the state's need to address McCleary. And so what we'll see next is the Senate Republicans come out with their budget draft that shows what they believe, to be the state role in addressing the McCleary mandate. And then from there, then it'll be, kicked off to the House Democrats. And so we'll see the initiation of that back and forth between the two chambers and that longer discussion around how is the state going to work toward addressing. So Daniel, back to the basics. We've talked about a LAP and we've talked about the levy cliff. What is a RAD district? Yeah, so RAD stands, sorry, good question around these acronyms that we're using. It's a required action district. And so again, as I was mentioning, right, these are, our state's means to create accountability for our schools that are, at the lowest levels of achievement and rates of improvement. And so, basically what happens with the RAD district, right, is that they are then identified and then the state provides additional resources and support in order to address those lowest performing schools to increase achievement. I'd like to point out for many of you who've been wondering about asking questions around the governor's budget that Lev has on our website a 15-minute podcast of the governor answering some questions around his podcast. So please take a look at that if you want more interest, if you're interested in that. So you mentioned that the governor's budget did not address the levy cliff. What would happen if there is no fix? Around the levy cliff, if there is no fix, eventually it'll go back to the previously allowed amount that local districts could raise around their levies. So right, so there was an initial raise, and so what will happen is, if the legislature addresses McCleary, then that'll go back down sooner. If they don't, then there's an additional year that's permitted, whereas the local districts are allowed to have that increased percentage. But ultimately, what will happen if the levy cliff is not addressed specifically is that it'll default back to the originally permitted amount. Who replaced Andy Hill as chief budget writer? Good question. I don't know. I believe it's Braun. Okay. See, this is why it's multiple people. It's three people here at Lab looking at this because you guys ask such great questions. We have about 4 minutes left. If anybody has any additional questions, I can probably do 2 or 3 more, but you need to put them into the chat. I have a question here that isn't really about education funding from the League of Education Voters perspective, but what is the status of the constitutionality of charter schools in our state? How can an individual citizen get involved in protecting public school funding? From the League of Education Voters perspective, charter schools are constitutional, they are public schools, and they are operating in the state of Washington. There are plenty of organizations to work with who don't agree with our position, and I welcome you to join them. It's definitely a debate in our state, but we have some excellent schools up and running. And for anybody else on there, if you'd like a tour of a charter school to see what they're doing with our public dollars, the League of Education Voters organizes tours for you to visit them and ask these questions. Will Lev make the presentation slides available?
Yes. I can answer that one.
We also record this presentation, so you can forward it to your friends and they can listen in on it. And we have quite a few who listen later. One last question, if we don't have any, I'll wait 1 minute, 30 seconds. Again, I'd like to remind you that we have a podcast about the governor's budget on our website, and I want to thank each of you for joining today. If you have any additional comments or questions about this LEVinar, please contact me, Kelly, K-E-L-L-Y, @educationvoters.org. Recording of today's presentation will be available. Please feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. Our next LEVinar will be on Tuesday, January 24th at 12:30. It'll be conducted by Washington STEM on career-connected learning. In the governor's budget, that would be called CTE. And then I have one last question I'm going to take, and then we are finished. What is the new Department of Children and Family Services?
Sure, great question. It's probably one that Eric can answer better than I can. So one, it's a proposal, and it's around the consolidation of the Department of Early Learning as well as other entities. But I'll kick it back to Eric because I know he's sat on a few groups to talk about it.
I have, yes. The Department of Children and Family Services takes certain components from DSHS, the Department of Social and Health Services, and takes the components that work with families primarily and rolling them into the Department of Early Learning. So the concept is having wraparound services to take care of health, for example, home visits, and early learning, so that it all works together. You have more communication between the different aspects of government agencies working with families and young children. Eventually, they're going to roll in juvenile justice as well. So that way they'll handle all aspects of children's well-being and education in one place. And that's legislation that's being proposed this session, and it was spearheaded by the governor.
Thank you, Eric. I hope you can all join us on Tuesday, January 24th at 12:30 for Career Connected Learning by Washington STEM. And I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season, and we will talk to you in January.